Hello, I'm leaning on a farm gate in the heart of the West Wales countryside. Sheep and lambs to either side, and you can hear them. Go on, do your stuff, sheep. Anyway, take my word for it, they're there. And just out of earshot of the sheep lives the man I've come to see, Professor David Wulstan. 52 years ago, he founded a vocal group, the Clerkes of Oxenford, whose work can truly be described as pioneering and inspirational. Those two words get a bit overused, but I've chosen them carefully and I think correctly, because today's early music choirs and consorts owe the Clerkes and David an incalculable debt. He wouldn't have me say anything of the sort, of course. Now in his mid-70s and winding down a little after a distinguished academic career at the universities of Oxford and Aberystwyth, he includes in his list of who's who recreations Aikido, self-defence, in brackets, instructor, bemoaning the decline of the English language, and he's already said firmly that if I call him a musicologist, he'll be putting his martial arts into action. I shall be watching my intellectual P's and Q's. David, we're sitting in your sitting room, in your house. So I've sort of got you captive. My first question to you has to be, if you don't want me to call you a musicologist, how would you like to be described?
I would not like to be called whatever word you used.
Is it like the Scottish play for actors? Is it a word I shouldn't use at all in this room?
I think Sir Thomas Beecham had the right attitude. People who can look at music but can't understand it.
Right.
So I agree with him. No, I'm just simply a musician, and I happen also to be a scholar in various fields.
How did your interest in early music begin?
I wasn't that interested in early music until I came across Harold Watkins Shaw, and we had heated arguments about this, that and the other, and I showed him a reconstruction of Gibbons' I Am the Resurrection and the Life, and he said, "That's very good. Which part did you reconstruct?" And I said, "Well, actually it was two, and if you can't tell, it's obviously all right." And he said, "You ought to go on and do more of this," and so I did. I've been reconstructing music ever since.
What's your method of working? Is there a lot of pacing up and down the room, or do you just quietly have some piles of music and a pencil and go to it methodically?
The word methodical is not one in my vocabulary. My father always used to say, a tidy study means a sterile mind. So the answer is, I just do it. I think it's important, I'm not joking now, I think it's important when you're reconstructing somebody's music, not simply to know his style, but actually to be able to get into it and be a composer yourself. I'm not trying to make myself out to be a good composer or great composer, but at least I can compose. I know what composing is about, and it is about not doing things rather than doing things. And the same with reconstructing. It's not the possibilities, it's just to say this one is the one he would have chosen.
How and when did the Clerkes of Oxenford begin?
It was in the 1960s. I'd come up to Oxford quite late because I'd done all sorts of other things beforehand. We decided to have a men's voice ensemble and did that, I think, for several years. And then a little later, it suddenly occurred to me that if we sang other pieces, they would go off the top because the girls would not be able to sing in the stratosphere.
I suppose I'm stating the obvious here, but it must have been rather revelatory to many of the chaps whom you recruited for the original Clerkes?
Well, it was revelatory in that I did pick composers who were then obscure, like Sheppard, who I was very fond of and I was convinced was one of the greatest. The problem was that fate, with its usual insouciance, had left one of his part books behind, and no one was prepared to reconstruct those parts. But we sang a lot of Sheppard, yes, and we did make a feature of the male voices, so it was AATB, or in some cases AAT baritone bass. But the poor old tenors, on the whole, used to have to sing the cantus firmus, so it was quite obvious that Sheppard and other composers didn't think much of tenors.
Could you put into one sentence what a cantus firmus is?
I'm not sure, indeed, that it's the right term, but it's usually nowadays used in modern parlance for a plain chant, which is in longish notes, sometimes very long notes, which is the basis of a longer piece.
David, the Clerkes didn't stay all male for too long. You needed women. I mean, doesn't everybody, but why were women voices required?
I realised that a lot of Sheppard was written for a different kind of ensemble, and there were at least two other voices above the altos, the countertenors. And if we sang the pieces at the same pitch as we'd sung pieces like Laudem Dicite, the top voices would go off the stave. And so I scratched my head a good deal, read some contemporary works on the subject, such as Charles Butler's Principles of Music, which was printed in the 1650s, and realised that there were two separate boys' voices, one called a treble and one called a mean, the treble being a very, very high voice and the mean being what we would call a sort of Vienna voice, choir voice. And these very high voices needed to be either boys or ladies who had been gently persuaded by me.
And this is where my other guest on today's Early Music Show comes in. I'm very happy that Sally Dunkley, singer and scholar, very well known in the early music world, has joined us today in Wales. Sally, you were a clerk. Were you persuaded or did you beseech? And when was that?
Well, I came across the Clerkes of Oxenford by very good fortune between the time that I had been to Oxford for my interview, hoping to go and be a student there, and the time that I actually went up. I found this tiny little paragraph advertising a concert by a group called the Clerkes of Oxenford, and I recognised the name of the director, David Wulstan, as the person who had tried to tie me in knots in my entrance interview. So having recognised the name, I went along to the concert and I was just blown out of my seat with such exciting music making. I was hooked by that stage. Then I later became a student in Oxford and I remember attending a Clerkes concert. And I think the term after that, there was a little advert somewhere saying, looking for sopranos that can sing high and not wobble. So I went along and this was a profound part of my life for a long time.
Well, David, it has to be said that back in 1967, the wobble was a sort of prerequisite for sopranos. How did you go about creating the sound that you wanted?
I did have certain difficulties. It took about a year to tutor people into singing in a different way, because, of course, a lot of people have singing lessons, and singing lessons is about the worst thing you can have,
Dreadful.
Apart from elocution lessons. And so I had to uneducate them and get them to sing properly, not to open their mouths, not to lift their heads up like that, and all the rest of it. All the sorts of things you're told at school to do.
Sally, was it a gruelling process being uneducated?
Well, I think I sang most of this music at this particular time on willpower and determination. I had no vocal technique anyway and not very much confidence, but I really, really wanted to sing the music. And for the first year or three, I did try to sing those very high parts. I can't think how, But anyway, there soon were people who could sing those high parts and make it sound easy. And of course, now there are many, many people that have mastered that technique.
And the other point is that it isn't just simply the high voices, it's that each of the voices, the treble, the mean, alto, tenor and bass, they are all focused in exactly the same way. So you get what you might call an ethereal profundity rather than an acutely abysmal sound. This is the whole point of polyphony, particularly when you're, well, say, doing the 40-part motet. You've got to be able to hear all the voices, and they've all got to be peaking without doing anything by marking the thing, saying, sing a lot here. I don't want to do that. All I want to do is to let the composer have his voice. I'm trying to be his executor under his will, and I'm trying to do what he wanted. I don't want to put my personality on the music. I want his personality to come out. And that's all directing is about, I think.
Some time back, there was a review of one of the Clerkes recordings which spoke of the miracle of the choir master's art. Such a great quote to put on any publicity. And I always feel when I listen to that 1989 recording and I look at the cast list of people that were singing in it, and many of them are different names from the ones that sang in the recordings 15 years before. And yet the sound is so consistent. So it seems to me that David Wulstan's absolutely uncompromising demands of voices were played out in that recording, in that he managed to get people to sing in a particular way that he wanted them to sing. And there's the proof.
Let's talk a little about Sheppard, because his music is so inspiring. Why is it that he is, until recently, less well known than so many of his contemporaries?
Well, he got dealt two duff cards, I think, out of the pack. The first was much of his music is extant in only X-1 part books, so a number of things have to be reconstructed. And secondly, he had the audacity not to be born or to die in any noticeable way, so as to have a centenary.
It's also to do with things that happened in the 20th century, because the grand volumes of Tudor church music that were published by the Carnegie Trust in the 1920s and 30s, the volumes of Sheppard were planned, and then the stock market crash, the money disappeared. So it didn't come out in print at that time. And most of Sheppard's music was published in the late 70s, early 80s.
Sally, you studied with David, and you've got some very impressive work in the editing field to your credit, for which you are widely acknowledged. Are there any absolutely inviolable rules that you learnt from David Wulstan?
I learnt a lot about editing and a lot more about copy editing and proofreading from David, because I acted as a sort of apprentice copy editor to one of his volumes of Gibbons' reconstructed verse anthems. That taught me a lot about how carefully you have to go through every score, looking at every symbol.
And David, do you have any inviolable rules? Or is the inviolable rule that there are no rules?
This certainly happened in the case of Praise the Lord, O My Soul by Gibbons. This was one of the peculiar pieces of reconstruction I did. First of all, I had to reconstruct the vowel parts and the voice parts. But secondly, unusually, I had to reconstruct the words as well. Because although Praise the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, praise his holy name, is the name of a psalm, he didn't carry on with the same psalm, so I had to chase the rest of the words all around the 150 psalms, and you know how many verses there are in some of them. So anyway, This version is the version I realised in the end was the right one, and I got the words wrong in the edition I did. Interestingly enough, the big chorus, "Praise the Lord, O my soul," repeats itself all the way through the piece, except at the end when the chorus changes, and you'll recognise a little bit of "Oh, clap your hands together, all you people," at the very end. This was obviously composed before "Oh, clap your hands together, all you people." This is one of Gibbons's only anthems with trebles and means in them.
Now we're going to hear a piece by a modern composer, not a Tudor composer, actually D. Wulstan, your setting of Psalm 130, and I think this performance was recorded at your 70th birthday party.
Well, not the 70th birthday party, the chapel concert which preceded the party, which was past members of the Clerkes of Oxenford. And in this particular psalm, I was very pleased that the St. Peter's College choir sang, because they sing in the same sort of manner that the Clerkes used to sing, due to the direction of Roger Allen, their music director. And they very kindly sang. It's not exactly a composition, it's more of an Anglican chant, but it does perhaps emphasise another aspect of my work, which is a deep interest in the psalmody of the Bible. And I prefer Anglican chanting to any other forms of psalmody, simply because it sounds to me to reproduce the rhythms of the Hebrew Psalter rather better than many other forms of singing psalms. So this is my setting of Psalm 130, which is a very difficult psalm technically because it has too many syllables in one of the parts, and I solve the problem here by adapting the rhythm of the chant.
Well, I was very honoured to be invited to come along on that occasion, but I couldn't. But Sally, you were indeed there, and I trust singing.
I was indeed, yes. Yes. As soon as I opened my mouth, I was told off. So nothing had changed, really.
It's good to hear that there are things in life that are constant. Marvellous. Now, we've talked about the scholarly baton that you have passed on, but actually you and Sally have collaborated on several things.
Oh, many.
How does that work between the two of you?
The main thing that we worked on together was Tallis's Mass Pua Natus, which we started working on a very long time ago. Tallis's Mass Pua Natus is in 7 voice parts, and pieces like this do not exist in Tallis's autograph. If only they did. They exist in part books from decades later, sections of which are lost. So in Pua Natus, out of the 7 parts, you have to reconstruct one voice in half of the Gloria and in part of the Agnus Dei, and 2 voices in another part of the Agnus Dei, and reconstructing 2 voices out of 7 is actually really hard. So the best bits of that reconstruction are David Wulstan's work. Some wonderful moments that make me smile every time I hear them. They're so lovely.
David, are you conscious of being a pioneer? You started the Clerkes in 1961. The last concert was 1989, I think.
No idea, can't remember.
Nearly 30 years. of this group, during which time huge changes in public perception and the amount of public interest in Tudor church music and early music generally. Do you feel, 30 years on from that, do you feel like a pioneer?
Well, it would be nice to feel that one had pioneered in various things, but I just feel it's a job that I have to do, like climbing Everest. Not that I'm going to try.
Because the music of John Sheppard was there.
I thought that needed
an airing.
Not only Sheppard, many other composers too.
Yes, I took Sheppard to represent the Himalayas, just for today.
My feeling was that at the time that I was singing in the Clerkes as a young person, we had a great spirit of an awareness that we were doing something different and something new. Different in lots of ways, in that the style, the singing style that the Clerkes presented was very different from anything that was going on in a mixed voice choir at that time. Also, when we sang music by Sheppard in particular, you could feel the audience sit up and smile and love it, because we were bringing this really great music to an audience at a time when performances of Sheppard were very, very rare indeed. And also other pieces big pieces by Tallis, William Mundy. This music was not in the concert repertoire at that time, and it's one of the things that I'm most pleased about, actually, that in my lifetime that music has gone from being the preserve of a tiny specialist audience to a really wide audience. I think about it because with the 16, about 3 years ago, we sang Sheppard's great Media Vita, which is a 20-minute piece, which takes some doing, and more than 10,000 people in the UK attended those concerts. I can't believe, when I was a student, that could ever have been going to come about. And I'm really pleased that it has.
Such a greater number of listeners than would have heard the piece in Sheppard's lifetime.
Of course. Yep.
I mean, bigger doesn't have to mean better, but in this case it does, doesn't it?
Yes.
It is
and
better.
I mean, when you think back, 20 years ago, 30 years ago particularly, or more, would you have dared to programme a 20-minute polyphonic piece to an audience? And I wouldn't have done.
Yes.
So times have changed for the better.
Spem alium. David, I do hope that it's gratifying for you that Gramophone magazine recently declared the Clerkes recording of Tallis's mighty Spem alium to be the best. What are your memories of the recording? Where did you do it?
All I can recall is doing it in Merton College, and conducting the thing was bad enough. You see these 40 people, you hear more or less the same chord all the way through. You see the lips opening and shutting, and you wonder, where am I? And I certainly remember coming to the end of a very long session and thinking, I'm completely lost. If I give the last beat, is it going to come on the right one or not? And I just thought to myself, it's going to have to be this one. So I put the downbeat and stopped them, and thank goodness it was the right place.
What was the broken glass sound?
It was a way of singing loudly and using a certain amount of nasal resonance. It was particularly characteristic of the altos, and we used to call it the broken glass noise. It's a particular kind of nasal resonance which makes it sound loud, but is not actually pushing. In other words, it's not phonemically pushing. It's just simply the number of frequency ranges that are in the formant.
Sally, has that informed your technique in later years?
No, completely beyond me. I would say that most ensembles of this kind are led by one particular voice part, different in each case. In the Clerkes, it was always the altos, the countertenors, who were allowed to sing louder than everybody else and who characteristically sang with what I would call a cut glass sound, a very bright and nasal voice production. You only have to hear a couple of notes to know that it's one of those people. That sound is distinct from that of any other group, I think.
But it wasn't always the broken glass sound. We used that when we were trying to make a particular statement. But in something like In Manus Tuas, which we've heard earlier, we did a different sort of thing and used much more chest resonance to make the sound more hooded and therefore to convey the smell of incense, really, which is a slightly different thing from the broken glass noise.
The smell of incense, broken glass or cut glass, depending on where you're coming from. Now, David, I don't think I'm going to get you to do this. I want Sally to do this. Will you sum up for me why we all owe David Wulstan and the Clerkes of Oxenford so much?
The experience of singing in the Clerkes, which was shared by lots of us over different generations, and also the experience of studying music with David Wulstan, has left so many of us with a profound love of the music, in particular the polyphonic music of 16th century England. And we've all valued our experience of being inspired by David's love of that music in turn. We've all dealt with it in different ways, I think. I see it now as though he planted the seeds of interest in that music, and we have each worked those out in our different ways. I'm not talking about singing music at the high pitch that he has always propounded, and I don't see that that's really the point. The point to me is about inspirational music making. There is nothing like it. It was wonderful. And it's really interesting to listen to some of these recordings decades later and have that confirmed in so many ways.
It was the friendship between the people and also the fact that they were willing to let the composer say what he had to say, and I was just there to help the composer come forward. We tried not to interpret. We tried just to let the poor old composer have his word.
Well, David Wulstan, you presided over Sally Dunkley's initial Oxford interview, and she got in.
And I've still got the evidence.
You've still got the evidence. Despite that, the two of you are still, several decades later, good friends. Are you happy with Sally's assessment?
Well, I'm embarrassed, I think, rather than
that was the
else.
aim.